Welcome to Bed Crime Stories Podcast. I'm your host, T. To my bed crimers, hi, how you doing? Hope you're having a great day. To anyone new here, a warm welcome. Thank you for checking out my channel. Let me just ask that after listening to or watching the video, if you find you enjoyed it or learned something, do me a favor, smash that like button and consider subscribing. Also, if you appreciate my work, please consider supporting the channel with a Patreon membership. Now, let's dig in. It was a hot midsummer day in California. So hot, in fact, that the black tar filling the holes in the road had melted and was glistening in the sun. The temperature reached 94 degrees Fahrenheit by late afternoon. The year was 1976. The city was Chowchilla, a sleepy hamlet surrounded by farm fields in the central. Chowchilla back then was about as small town cozy as it gets. The downtown was comprised of only a few streets and shops. In fact, you could drive through the whole thing in under a minute. It was an old school kind of place where everyone looked out for everyone else. People left their doors unlocked, kids played outside unsupervised until their mothers called them home, dads pushed lawnmowers across lush lawns after work, while the mothers readied the homemade meatloaf for dinner. The sounds of kids laughing as they played kick the can late into the evening was Chowchilla's summer solstice soundtrack. One thing that was absent from Chowchilla back then was fear, at least in the minds of the children. But all that would change on July 15th. 26 students from Dairyland Elementary School had spent the day at the massive Chowchilla Fairground swimming pool. By late afternoon, they'd swum to their heart's content, so much so that the skin on their fingers and toes seemed permanently pruny. A little before 4 p.m., their bus driver, a strong but quiet man named Ed Ray, pulled up to take them home. Off the kiddos trotted in their still wet swimming suits, clutching their towels as they climbed up the bus's thick black steps. Those joyful hours before getting on the bus would mark the end of the kids' childhood innocence. Soon they would experience a terror and a darkness that most human beings will never know. As Ray drove the bus down the rural roads, flanked by fields of growing corn, the kids pushed down the windows to let in the warm summer breeze. Some of them were laughing, others were singing, all were ready to get home. Ray let off the first two kids without incident, but suddenly, without warning, he exclaimed, "What the heck is this?" The bus was at a stop sign. A white van was parked smack in the middle of the intersection. Ray tried to get around it, but it was impossible. Out from the van came a man with a pair of pantyhose pulled tight over his face and a gun in his hand. Never a good sign. The man approached the front of the bus and ordered Ray to open the door. With the gun aimed at his chest, Ray felt forced to comply. Trying to back the bus up and speed away just wasn't viable. As the man walked up the steps, Ray asked him, "What's going on?" The man immediately put the gun to Ray's head and replied, "Shut up and move to the back." Ray dutifully walked to the back of the bus. A second masked man then climbed aboard. He was armed with something even more terrifying, a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. Now the children were fully aware that this wasn't some prank, and those men weren't trying to be silly with the hose on their head. The kids felt fear, real, raw fear that was not fleeting. The pantyhose tightly pulled over the men's faces made it seem like they had no eyes, just empty hollows. One kid, a 6-year-old named Larry Park, would later describe it as like looking at death. One of the armed men got into the driver's seat seat, and soon the bus was moving, but it wasn't headed in the right direction. The kids were wondering where they were being taken, but they didn't dare ask. A third man was following the bus in the white van. He too had pantyhose over his face. All three evildoers were dressed identically. Little Larry Park was now secretly imagining what it was going to feel like to die. He was so sure that that was what was coming. Larry was so frightened that he literally could not move. Bus driver Ed Ray was looking tense, and he was speaking to the kids in a harsh tone that they'd never heard from him before, sternly telling them to be quiet and to remain seated. At some point, the bus veered off the road onto a dry riverbed. As the bus lurched forward, it came to a stop in a grove of soaring bamboo plants. The bamboo was so tall that it towered many feet above the bus. As the kids looked out the window, they spotted another van, a green one, and it appeared to be down in that grove waiting for them. Here's how a little girl named Jennifer Brown would later describe it for her parents.
And there was two guys standing from the bus door to the van door with guns, with pantyhose over their heads so we wouldn't run out. And then, they pulled the van right up to the bus door.
The three masked men forced the children, who were all aged between 5 and 14, off the bus one by one and herded them into the green and white vans. The kids were told to jump from the bus to the vans. The kidnappers didn't want any of their footprints in the soil. As 10-year-old Jody Huffington was about to jump over to the man with a sawed-off shotgun jabbed its barrel into her stomach. Jody blurted out, "I was doing what you said." The man held her there like that until the one van pulled away and the second van pulled up. For Jody, those moments in time seemed to take forever. She was convinced the man was going to shoot her. Finally, the man moved the weapon away and allowed her onto the van. The rest of the children and driver Ed Ray also got into the second van. Then, when all the children were inside, the men closed the doors. Pitch darkness enveloped the children. Although they couldn't see it, the vans had been rigged with wood paneling that covered all the walls, and the windows had been painted over. No one could see in, and no one could see out. The kids were now in a moving jail cell, headed to God knows where. The masked men sped off in the two vans, leaving the school bus camouflaged and concealed in the bamboo grove. From the road, no one would ever spot it despite its bold color. By now, some of the kids felt like animals on the way to the slaughterhouse. Right around that same time, little Jennifer Brown's mother, Joan, arrived home from work to find the house dark and empty. Where were the children? Noticing that the countertops were spotless, without any of the usual peanut butter smears and breadcrumbs, and the chairs to the kitchen table were exactly as they were that morning, Joan knew the kids had not returned home from summer school. Most of the kids' parents were also now realizing that their kids weren't home. The local police were soon alerted to the strange happening. In fact, the phone at the station was being bombarded with frantic calls from parents. 26 children and one bus driver had vanished without a trace. When the media got wind of it, they too began calling the police station. As the hours ticked by and the sun began to set, worried parents headed out with the police to retrace the school bus's normal route. They crisscrossed the area's many rural roads, but found nothing. Then, just before dusk, a police pilot flying overhead spotted the big yellow bus nestled in the bamboo grove about 7 miles outside Chowchilla. When the sheriff arrived at the grove, he noticed tire tracks in the soil. It was clear someone had backed a vehicle up to the bus's door, and the kids had been herded off of it and onto other vehicles. The sheriff recognized right away that he needed the big guns to help him get those kids back. He immediately called the governor for help. The parents, now out of their minds with a cocktail of anxiety and fear, were all assembled in the Chowchilla fire station. 30 FBI agents soon arrived. 30. The authorities weren't taking any chances. It's not every day that seemingly sophisticated kidnappers nabbed 26 little kids and their bus driver. Back inside the two pitch-black vans, the children were now suffering not only from fear but also from heat exhaustion. Without air conditioning, the vans were like hot boxes for torture. Some kids were banging on the panel where the driver's seat was located, begging to be let out. The kidnappers' response: shut up. They drove for what seemed like endless hours without any bathroom breaks. Some of the kids soiled themselves. Suffering from terror, heat, and fatigue, the kids would suddenly fall asleep only to jerk back up when the van hit a bumpy patch. The younger kids, those who were 5 and 6, looked to the older ones for comfort. A few little ones laid across the older kids' laps crying. Little Jennifer Brown told the young kiddos to be brave because everything was going to be all right. Inside, though, she was just as afraid as they were. Some older kids sang songs to calm the younger ones. On heavy rotation were Boogie Nights, Love Will Keep Us Together, and If You're Happy and You Know It, Clap Your Hands. Anything to distract worried minds. But the sing-along came to an abrupt stop when the vans pulled off the road and onto a very rough, unpaved path. By now the children had been held hostage in those vans for 12 long hours. The masked man opened the van with driver Ed Ray inside first. They took him out and immediately closed the door. This added to the kids' fears. As the only adult with them, he was their primary source of comfort and guidance. Without him, the kids felt even more vulnerable. But then the masked man opened the door again, grabbed the first kid inside, and slammed the door shut once again. Adding to the terror, each time the door opened, the kids inside couldn't see anything outside. They began to fear that the men were killing their friends one by one. Little Jennifer Brown kept moving to the back of the van, hoping the men would never reach her. But eventually every kid was removed. Once outside, the kids found themselves staring into harsh lights. The children couldn't tell whether they were at the beach, in the desert, or even still in California. The men asked each child, "What's your name?" Jody Heffington, who had an attitude by now and was pretty much royally pissed off, gave them a smart-ass answer. She said her name was Puddin' Tang. They told her, "If you don't tell us your name, you're never going to see your parents again. Do you understand?" Sensing they weren't joking, Jody finally coughed up her legal moniker. The men then took all her belongings, pointed to a hole, and told her to go down it. The opening led down to an old truck trailer. Ed Ray and the kids from the first van were already down there. It seems the kidnappers had dug a deep grave for the massive truck trailer, and they'd buried it in the ground. A hole cut into the top was the only entrance and exit. At the back of the huge trailer was a table with jugs of drinking water. There were also some mattresses on which boxes of cereal, loaves of bread, and peanut butter were scattered. In the wheel wells, the perpetrators had cut holes for makeshift toilets. The hostages could hear fans, so they knew there was some ventilation. The kidnappers seemed like they wanted their victims to survive the ordeal. 14-year-old Michael Marshall was in van number 2 with some of the younger kids. At 14, that put him in the position of being looked upon as a grown-up. The little ones were clinging onto Michael, scared out of their minds. The kidnappers soon came in to remove the kids one by one as they'd done with the first van. Soon Michael found himself alone in the van with the youngest child, a little girl. Michael, terrified that the kidnappers had maybe killed all the others, couldn't bear to hand over the little girl to them. So when they opened the door, he went out first. He had to literally rip the little girl's hands off of him. It was incredibly hard for him to do. As soon as Michael got down into the buried trailer, he was relieved to find all the other kids in there along with Mr. Ray. The little girl eventually climbed down as well. But then the kidnappers removed the ladder, threw a roll of toilet paper down, and told the kids and Ray that they'd be back for them. The masked men then covered the opening to the buried trailer with a manhole cover. Over that, they placed 2 100-pound industrial batteries, and then they shoveled dirt over the lot. The children could hear the sounds of all this burying. They now realized that they were being being buried alive 12 feet under the ground. This realization set off an intense round of screaming and crying. One child even fainted, and despite trying to comfort the kids, Ed Ray too began to cry. He was sure the roof of the truck was going to cave in at any minute. The sides of the trailer started to bow in. Ed Ray and Mike Marshall scoured the trailer, trying to find a way out. They decided the manhole cover was the only option, but it was so heavy. Try as he and Mike could, the cover would not budge. Ray finally made the decision that everyone needed some rest. Despite their exhaustion, it was hard to sleep. Mike Marshall was so upset, thinking he would never get to see his mother again. He was haunted by the thought that he never got to say goodbye to her. By now, the fans on the ventilators had stopped. Some kids saw this as a sign that they really were going to die down there. Without sunlight, the captives had no idea what time it was. Was it day or night? No one knew. Adding to their worries, they were now out of water and food, and the walls of the trailer continued to cave in under the weight of the dirt. One boy kept kicking the wood planks that had been rigged to support the roof. That wasn't helping. Ed Ray and Mike Marshall decided they were going to try everything and anything to get out of there. Better to die trying than to sit around like compliant sheep. They decided to stack all the mattresses up under the manhole to see how high they could get. The kids stood on Edward's shoulders to try and push the cover away. They all took turns. Mike Marshall was key in this endeavor. When it was his turn, he simply refused to give up and kept giving it all his might. Finally, he mustered every last inch of strength he had, and he managed to push the cover aside. As he crawled up through the hole, though, he found himself in a box that was barely large enough for his body. Atop the box were the 2 industrial batteries and listen to how Michael described it.
I get on top of it. I get on down of this box. I started hitting and pounding and hitting and pounding. He dug until he was exhausted, and then he kept on digging. There was no quit in him.
Adding to the anxiety of the situation, no one knew if the 3 armed men were going to be standing there if they managed to wrestle their way out. But it was a chance they had to take. After much digging, a ray of sunlight suddenly pierced through the opening and shot down into the trailer. In that ray of light danced millions of dust particles, and each one gave the kids hope. Mike Marshall was relieved to see that the masked men were nowhere in sight. One by one, the children were lifted out of the trailer. They found themselves in a rock quarry. The quarry was in Livermore, California, 100 miles away from Chowchilla. By now, it was 8 p.m. on July 16th, and the children had been in the hole for almost 16 hours. As they looked around, they noticed conveyor belts and then a guard station in the distance near Shadow Cliffs Regional Park. They walked over, and the shocked guard there immediately called the authorities. The escape had taken place before the kidnappers had been able to call in their ransom demands. They hadn't counted on the Chowchilla Police Department telephone lines being overloaded with calls from the families and the media. Every time the kidnappers dialed the station, they got a busy signal. Once the police arrived, they took photos of each and every child and of Ed Ray. They were documenting the evidence. Finally, the kids felt safe again. After the photos were taken, the children were put back on a bus and were transported to the closest facility that could hold them all, the Santa Rita Rehabilitation Center, otherwise known as the Santa Rita Jail. The kids noticed the prison wire surrounding it, which had to have felt ominous at the time. They were taken inside to classrooms and were given apples and soda, as well as fresh overalls to put on. Adult-sized, the overalls dwarfed their small bodies. They had to roll up the pant leg and the sleeves. Some kids flapped their sleeves and joked, "Look, I'm a bird." Doctors then came in to assess each child's condition. Evidence. The police also questioned every kid separately, but the victims were unable to say much about their kidnappers' faces because of the pantyhose. After 4 hours at the jail, the children were finally allowed to go home. Can you imagine? They must have been so ready to see their parents. They were put on a Greyhound bus, and the police escorted the bus back to Chowchilla. The ordeal had lasted 28 hours in total, and during that time, those kids and that driver had experienced what it's like to be buried alive. The police discovered that the buried truck trailer was registered to the son of the quarry owner, 24-year-old Frederick Newhall Woods IV. Woods had concocted the kidnapping with the help of two brothers, 22-year-old Richard and 24-year-old James Schoenfeld. The Schoenfelds had previously been convicted of motor vehicle theft, for which they'd been sentenced to probation. A warrant was executed on the estate of Woods' father, and there the police recovered one of the guns used in the kidnapping, as well as a draft ransom note. Some of the wording echoed a story called "The Day the Children Vanished," which had been published in Alfred Hitchcock's Daring Detectives, and it was displayed in the Chowchilla Public Library as well. Was that where the three men got the idea? Later, Woods would say he was inspired by the Clint Eastwood movie Dirty Harry. Through the ransom note, the police could see the captors had concocted the kidnapping plot to hold the children hostage for a ransom fee of $5 million. It was a plot 18 months in the making. The men felt that the state would gladly pay the money from a recently announced budget surplus. The plot unraveled when the three captors, who were by then also exhausted, decided to take a nap. This left the children and Ed Ray a short window in which to escape. Once the warrants were announced, the three men fled town. Woods was arrested 2 weeks later after fleeing to Vancouver, British Columbia. James Schoenfeld had been captured earlier the same day in Menlo Park, California, while Richard Schoenfeld had voluntarily turned himself in to the authorities 8 days after the kidnapping. Only Richard expressed remorse for the crime. It turned out Woods and the Schoenfelds came from wealthy families, but they were all deeply in debt. It sounds like their parents either weren't willing to bail them out of debt, or maybe the young men didn't want to let their parents know. James Schoenfeld later explained why they selected school children as their target victims. He said, quote, "We needed multiple victims to get multiple millions, and we picked children because children are precious. The state would be willing to pay ransom for them, and they don't fight back. They're vulnerable. They will mind." Once behind bars for a spell, Frederick Woods began concocting another get-rich scheme. He tried to convince a friend of his to turn the kidnapping into a film. In a letter from 1976 that was recently discovered, Woods wrote, "I think it would make a damn good movie of the week, if not a feature. It's big, real big, and a hot item everyone wants to know about. If you do make it into a film, all I want is a % of it," end quote. And guess what? A 2-hour made-for-television movie was created, but years later, and it aired on ABC in March of 1993. It was titled "They've Taken Our Children, The Chowchilla Kidnapping," and it starred Carl Malden as Ed Ray and Julie Harris as his wife. I don't think Woods had anything to do with this production, nor did he receive any monies from it. When it came time for their pleas, all three men pleaded guilty to kidnapping for ransom and robbery. However, they refused to plead guilty to infliction of bodily harm. A conviction on that count, in conjunction with the kidnapping charge, carried a mandatory life sentence in prison without the possibility of parole. The men were not going to set themselves up for that. They were tried on the bodily harm charge, found guilty, and given the mandatory sentence, but their convictions were later overturned by an appellate court that found that the physical injuries sustained by the children, mostly cuts and bruises, did not meet the standard for bodily harm under the law. The men were then sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. So now they had a chance to get out of prison someday. Richard and James Schoenfeld were paroled in 2012 and 2015, respectively. Richard, who was by then 57, had spent 36 years in prison for the crime. He got out first because he had freely expressed remorse and had turned himself in. James, who was then 64, lived behind bars for 39 years. Frederick Woods, as the primary planner of the crime, was the last to get out of prison. He was paroled on August 17th of 2022 at the age of 67. He had spent 46 years behind bars for the crime, which had endangered the lives of 27 human beings and caused them infinite emotional trauma. Some of the victims never got over the ordeal and turned to drugs to soothe their emotional pain and ongoing PTSD. Some, so plagued by the after effects of the crime, died young. Woods remained in prison the longest because he continued to minimize the crime over the years. He also was not a model prisoner and had a myriad of disciplinary infractions for possession of contraband, pornography, and cell phones. In 2016, a workers' compensation lawsuit filed against Woods revealed that he'd been secretly running several businesses from behind bars, including a gold mine and a car dealership. The heir to two wealthy California families, the Newhalls and the Woods, Frederick Woods eventually inherited a trust fund that was reportedly worth $100 million. Can you imagine? Here's this scheming, evil person, and he frickin' inherits a trust fund worth millions after committing this truly vicious crime. They say life is unfair, and I would submit that that's true. While he was in prison, Woods, likely thanks to his bank account, was married 3 times. I guess it's easy to attract wannabe wives when your net worth is in the millions. He even purchased a mansion about 30 minutes away from the prison for this rotation of women. How convenient. I think this dude should have been forced to hand over all his trust fund monies to those kids and Ed Ray. Or better still, his parents should have handed the trust fund over to their son's victims when they learned what he'd done. I mean, he pleaded guilty, so there was no question of his guilt. Had any one of those children died, maybe Woods' parents would have felt differently. Had Woods not come from a wealthy father who owned a rock quarry, he likely would not have pulled off the crime. Think about it. He needed to buy a truck with a large trailer. He needed a place in a remote location where he and his buddies could dig a giant hole without anyone questioning it. And today, this creep is likely living in a new mansion, maybe, enjoying his millions, while those victims who are still alive continue to have nightmares, panic attacks, and personality changes. Some victims, as I said, died early in life due to substance abuse and depression. The victims did get some monetary compensation paid out of Woods' trust fund. One survivor stated, though, that they'd each received just enough to pay for some serious therapy, but not enough to buy a house. As for bus driver Ed Ray, he received a California School Employee Association citation for outstanding community service. He had been a beloved bus driver, and he was credited, along with Mike Marshall, with getting those babies out of that buried truck trailer. Ray died on March 17th of 2012. In 2015, a park in Chowchilla was renamed the Edward Ray Park in his honor, and every February 28th, which was Ray's birthday, you can find the residents of Chowchilla celebrating Edward Ray Day. If anything positive can be said to have come out of this story, it's that good guys like Ed Ray and Mike Marshall can be found in society, people who have kind hearts, strong wills, and a dedication to doing what's right. The evil of the kidnapping plot also stands in stark contrast to the innocence of 1976 Chowchilla and the love of the children's devoted parents who jammed those police phone lines so much that the kidnappers never got a chance to make their $5 million ransom demand. Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories. Did you enjoy this? I hope so. If so, please hit that like button. Please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.